Hello again, everybody. My name is John D Healy. People know me because I produced this book a couple of years ago, and that's how it all started. About my good friend Stoney McGettigan. He was born in 1941, so it's his life stories up to 2 years ago. It's on audio, and you can get it on Amazon as well. It does have some adult content, so be careful. You want to go to confessions. I'm also sponsored by Liffey Moving Company, Liffey Van Lines here in New York City. They have a big birthday coming up next year. They'll be 50 years old, almost as old as Jeopardy. My podcast is called It's Good to Talk, and I usually have interesting guests on, all from different backgrounds, from science to music to singing to writing and all that. My guest today is no exception. He is a writer, songwriter, writer of a book, musician, and he's probably best known for his entry into the Eurovision Song Contest in 1994, which was a great year for everybody, I think, that particular year. And his song was called Rock and Roll Kids, and it was performed by himself and Paul Harrington. And we'll talk about that. Charlie, you're welcome to my podcast.
It's good to see you, John. You know, I just passed the old Mother Hubbard's place today as I was coming from Dublin. Sad to say it's no longer with us, but that was a great venture. When I just think of your story and that, you know, and starting off with a little caravan selling stuff and developing it into a restaurant.
Okay, Charlie. Today I want to know about your story.
Okay.
It's not about me, it's about you. Okay. Tell my listeners, like where you were born and what got you into music in the early days, they were early days, of course. We're going back a long time.
Well, not to preempt and talk about the book, but I found out so much about myself when I did start to do the book. And what I did was, being a musician, I said, what was the first piece of music I remembered? And the piece of music I remembered was a piece called ODonnell Abu. I don't know whether you're old enough to remember, but yes, way back in 1952, 53, the Radio Earn came on. It was preceded by the tune ODonnell Abu, played on an instrument, a bell-like instrument called a celeste. Right. So I thought that, where was I when I was listening to this? And I said I must have been in Dublin with my granny and my mum in Effer Road in Rathmines in Dublin. And, you know, when you start to do something like this, writing a book, for example, all the memories came flooding in. You know, I couldn't believe, I was only about 2.5 years of age, but I could remember so much detail about the brief 3.5 years spent, my first 3.5 years in Dublin City. Right. And the amount of characters and people. We lived next door, for example, to a Jewish family called the Greens, Jaime, Becky and Dick. And they were they used to bring me everywhere in their car. There was very few cars in those days, even in Rathmines. I think there was 2 on the road. And they used to bring me everywhere. If they were going anywhere, they'd bring me in the car. And of course, on a Saturday night, they'd be going to the synagogue. And of course, I used to call blue murder because I wasn't allowed to go to the synagogue as well. But, you know, it's remarkable the way your memory works. So after being in Dublin for about 2.5-3 years, and a lot of this is in detail in the book, I then moved back to Ballyshannon, where my dad worked with his father in a grocery business in the main street in Ballyshannon, McGettigan and McGowan's, and Dad was working there. And my mum moved back to Ballyshannon. You know, she was originally Dublin, and therefore then the rest of my life, up till I was 18, was spent in Ballyshannon. And Ballyshannon at that time was your typical Irish town, because in those days, John, there was no such thing as shopping centres or places that shopping malls as you'd have in New York. Literally, the whole town was self-contained. You could buy everything you needed in the town. You know, your winter clothes, your winter coat, and your winter pullovers and shoes and all that, and your summer sandals and your shorts and all that. And as well as that, everything was in the town. And in a shame in a way that we did lose that fact that we could be so self-contained, you know.
Yeah, I agree with you. So my guest today is Charlie McGettigan. He won the Eurovision Song Contest in 1994. He has a book out. The book is named after the song, The Rock and Roll Kids. I'll get that corrected in a minute. That's the name of the song anyway.
Yes.
Rock and Roll Kids. So, and if you like the podcast, hit like, and if you like to subscribe. And Charlie, let's get back to more of those memories from Ballyshannon. After Ballyshannon, where'd you go then?
Well, Ballyshannon, really, in fairness, Ballyshannon takes up so much of the book. My publisher was getting quite annoyed that he couldn't get me out of Ballyshannon, because in those days in Ballyshannon, for example, the first television, I remember, came to a fella called Joe Morra in Kildoney, and he bought it in, and it was a big brown affair with a small screen, and everybody used to come in from the area because Kildowney was a very small little place, and everybody would come in to watch the television in Joe's house, and Joe was the authority on the whole thing. You know, you couldn't. He owned it, but he used to call the television her all the time, and he'd come in into the shop to us, and God, he'd said there was great stuff on her last night, you know, and you know they'd all be in, everybody, and I remember the Miss World competition. Do you remember when that was on?
Yeah.
And I remember there was one night particular, and everybody, all maybe 9 or 10 people from the area, all sitting, and Joe had his own spot by the fire and a perfect view. And of course, the Miss World competition was on, and they were introducing the women. Miss Canada, 36, 22, 36. Miss New Zealand, whatever. And somebody says to Joe, what's them measurements they're shouting at? Them's their muscles, says Joe. You know, and Joe is such a lovely man, you know, and you got to know people so really well, you know, with all kinds of great. For example, the man that delivered the bread to our house was a man called John James Lawn. He would come in with maybe 2 dozen a batch and 3 dozen a plate. And in those days, there was only 2 types of bread. There was pan loaves or there were plain loaves, you know, and they are known as batch loaves. Yeah. And there was no such thing as sliced, believe it or not. You know, you haven't heard the expression before sliced pans. Before, and I remember John James would come in and he could calculate the old imperial measure. Even in America, they didn't have anything as difficult as pounds, shillings, pence, halfpence, and 3 farthings and farthings. Right. And he could calculate 3 dozen a batch at 7 pence 3 farthings and 2 dozen a plain. And he could calculate all this in his head. And he'd just shout across to my father, put that into the book, son, put that into the book. And he was never wrong. But the strange thing about John James Lawn is that he couldn't read or write, but he could calculate these extremely complicated figures. I've tried to do it recently, tried to go back to that and try and add up, you know, £2, 18 shillings and 6 pence. God, wouldn't have a clue how to do it.
We're spoiled with the calculator.
Yeah, but John James would also, he'd be playing cards the night before, and he would come in. My grandfather was a big card player, and he would literally detail every hand of cards from the beginning of the night till the end of the night, and who dealt what. And I hit him with the jack, and he hit me with whatever, you know. Yeah. And so with those kind of characters, it was very hard to leave Ballyshannon when I was writing the book, you know, because, you know, the place was just coming down with people. You know, there was a fun, and you know, the annoying thing, I suppose you found the same, when you finished the book, you realised, jickers, I left out somebody, you know.
That was like, say, for Stoney, when we were doing the book, Stoney wrote it with pencil, you know.
Yes.
Well, I was able to get him out of Leitrim pretty fast. I think he wanted to get out of Dower anyway. He's here, and that's his book, and that's how it all started. Yeah. But getting back to your book...
Is Stoney still alive, by the way?
People do ask that question a lot. He was alive and kicking,
Yeah, and did you kind of co-wrote the book with him, or
he wrote it in pencil. I had to format it into stories, because he would stop here and there, and then, like you said, he'd say, "Well, I forgot this, but that bit should be in at the beginning." Yeah. So as I did a podcast about explaining to people that want to write a book how to write a book. So basically, you have a beginning, you have a middle, and you have an end. So that's a simple way to do it. So I kept all his beginning of his life, which is Leitrim and Dower and all that. Yeah. And he did a stunt in Dublin as well. When he was in hospital, he had an accident and he almost had his arm amputated, you know?
Oh my God, yeah.
And people do ask, how did he almost lose his arm? And I tell them, you have to buy the book. Yeah. Now, getting back to your book.
Well, maybe I shouldn't tell any more secrets about the book, because
I read it. I speed read, and I really enjoyed it. But let's go back to the Eurovision for a second, and then we can come back to the book again.
Yeah,
you won in 1994. The song was "The Rock and Roll Kids," and it was you and
Paul Harrington,
yeah. It was written by Brendan Graham.
Brendan Graham, yeah.
Yeah. So how did the trio come together?
Well, I have a long journey, which is explained in the book, you know, from beginnings of music, when I heard music first on Radio Luxembourg, because back in those days, RTE or BBC didn't play pop music on the radio, you know. So one thing led to another, and eventually I knew Brendan Graham from, in those days there were a lot of song contests, Castlebar Song Contest, the Cavan, the Dunleary Song Contest, and of course the big one was the National Song Contest.
Correct.
But I met Brendan at a lot of song contests, and you know, we got to know each other fairly well, and we wrote a few songs together, and a few people sang them, But in 1992, he sent me this song called Rock and Roll Kids, and he asked me would I do a demo. Now, a demo, in case people didn't know, is a demonstration recording
Right.
of it.
Right.
So I was kind of big into Don Williams music at the time, and it came out in that kind of a style, and
Right.
it didn't really work.
Right.
So about a year later, he sent me another version by Paul Harrington. I'd only heard Paul Harrington on the radio, I never met him. And he said, I'm going to put that. And I said, that's the perfect version. It's just so right. Don't do anything. It was just a piano and a vocal. And I said, put it into the national song. And he put it in, and it didn't qualify. And I couldn't understand this. It was one of the best songs I'd ever heard. So the following year, Brendan, a very persistent man, he put it in again.
Right.
And it turned out that I was on the judging panel that year. And in those days, it was run very strictly. There was a firm of accountants who were watching everything you did. And I was on the panel, and I had to say, well, I know the singer, I know the songwriter, and I know the song. So I'm going to have to abstain. And the result was that Brendan didn't get through. So the following year, he put it in. And this time it clicked. And he rang me and he said, it just shows you how persistent the man was.
Well,
and he rang me and he said, I've qualified for the National Song Contest. And I said, but this was a big deal now, John, in those days. The National Song Contest was a big, big thing. And I said, I'm delighted, Brendan. And what was it with Rock and Roll Kids? Yeah, he said, yeah. He said, I said, no, I hope you didn't put dancing girls and singers and pictures and jumping up and down people, as people did in those days in the Eurovision.
Yeah, sure.
And he said, no, still Paul on the piano, but I think it needs something else. And I said, Brendan, no, don't. If it's not broken, don't fix it, And he said, what? I said, what do you think it needs? And he looked and he stopped for a while and he said, I think it needs you.
Right.
And I said, what? He said, it just needs that other element. And I think Paul was a bit harum-scarum, and I think he really wanted me just to take care of Paul.
Right, gotcha.
But anyway, it turns out after this big discussion here at home with the family and the whole lot, because something like Eurovision takes over your life if you're not careful.
Oh, yeah.
And so we agreed. I said, okay, we'll go into it. And we eventually ended up down in the concert hall down in Limerick University down there, and we won and we got through it. Now, as far as I was concerned at that stage, I had won because it was my first chance to ever represent Ireland at anything. I wasn't ever going to represent football or boxing or anything like that. It was, so this was my chance. So I didn't care. We had no idea about winning the Eurovision song. We just had won because we were getting to represent Ireland in front of the president, the Taoiseach,
and all of Europe,
and all of Europe, 300, 400 million people. And funny, people ask me, were you nervous? I was never more not nervous than I was because Brendan or Paul Harrington and myself, we were seasoned performers at this stage, and really we were only doing what we normally do. We just sing. He played the piano and sang, and I played the guitar and sang, and that's all we had. No orchestra, nothing.
Right. Excellent.
And it was the best choice we ever made.
I agree.
Didn't decorate it, and it won, and of course the rest is history. But the funny thing is, John, there hasn't been a gig since 1994 where I haven't sung Rock and Roll Kids, and it's still as popular as ever. The amount of people, like we were playing at the weekend there, Paul and myself, over in a nice concert over in Monaghan, and people we stopped singing and just let the crowd sing it. It's an anthem at this stage.
It sure is. Well, I grew up in Linamai, and my parents had the old ballroom there. So
really?
I was listening to bands setting up from the age of 6 or 7 years old. And I think when I was 7, I was working behind the mineral bar because there was no
drink in those days.
No drink allowed. But the bar was next door, right? And when the pub would close at 10:30, 11 o'clock, the ballroom was opening up. I became the youngest smuggler ever to bring in alcohol into the ballroom.
To your locals.
So my technique was simple. I can share it now because I'm talking to you, and I'm only telling you. I wouldn't tell anyone else. I would have to get a big, big carton of the potato chips.
Yes.
Or take them all out, and I would layer the bottom with naggins of whiskey and naggins of vodka, and then I would put all the potatoes back on top again. I would make sure the box was well taped on the bottom, like if you do the lifting, and then I would carry that box, and the local guard would be standing at the door of the ballroom, and I would walk past him and say, "Good night, Garda." And I would walk past with all the whiskey and vodka, and that made the night for the patrons because a lot of the men back then, the way the men were one side of the ballroom and
Yeah, well,
the
never
other
forget
side, and a lot of the lads would be shy, so they'd have to get a bit of courage into them. So I'd be in the middle bar, John, pass me out a naggin of vodka under the counter, and then they'd have their Sidone or Fanta Orange to mix it. And when they got a few of those into them, they were able to hit the floor and do the rock and roll kid dance. So, getting back to my guest today is Charlie McGettigan. His book is a memoir about the rock and roll kids. It's all about his life story from growing up, being introduced to music as a young man, and going all the way up to the top and winning the Eurovision Song Contest in 1994 with Paul Harrington. It's a great song. Tell us more about the rest of that story, Paul.
Well, the song itself is people often ask, because I write songs as well, and people ask me, how do you do this? And I said, you just need to be observant. And Brendan wrote the song after being at a Fats Domino concert in the National Stadium in Dublin. And he noticed that everybody came in, a lot of the men particularly came in, they were still in their business suits and their pinstripe suits and their ties and shorts and ties, because that age group, Fats Domino was from the 50s and 60s.
Right.
So, and he looked at them, and by the end of the night, Fats Domino had them dancing in the aisles. These fellas that looked like serious businessmen and accountants and solicitors.
Let their hair down, enjoy.
Yeah. And he wrote down a little bit on a back of a cigarette packet. He said, "They're like rock and roll kids." He said, and that's the reason I think that everybody can identify with it. If you listen to the lyrics, it's about a couple who are maybe not getting on so well, but they're wishing that they were back when they were rock and roll kids, when they were still in love and all that kind of stuff. And I think I think songs have to be, you have to be able to identify it in a song. You have to be able to say, I know what that feels like. So we had some great times. After winning, of course, you get on a kind of a European carousel. Those days there were very little, like we are talking to now on the internet and stuff like that. You literally had to travel through Europe to promote your song and appear on television stations all over the place.
And get radio playlists and
all that,
all of that, which is
hard
not
work.
easy.
Hard work, but with some brilliant ones, because I remember we did over 3 days. We did 250 radio interviews in Norway, because there was a huge amount of local radio stations in Norway, and I got so bored answering the same questions, I started to make things up. And when I went to write the book, I said, did I make this up, or did that actually happen? That kind of way. I remember we were playing in Frankfurt at the 750th anniversary of Frankfurt, the city of Frankfurt, and they had this enormous weekend festival on the big palisade in Frankfurt, and there were 100,000 people there.
Wow.
And Paul and myself were part of the show. We just got to go up and three or four songs and blah blah. So Ega was getting up and walking up on the stage and feeling hard proud of myself, playing to all these people. And next thing, this voice comes from the guy, "Get back to Drumshambo, McGettigan." So and I looked at somebody, isn't there? I looked. I couldn't see so many people. I couldn't see often. Hopefully when somebody might read the book and say that was me. That kind of,
true.
But living in Leitrim, you were kept very grounded. I remember, coming back. I remember going into Conway's Corner House, which was our local pub, and it was about maybe 3 or 4 weeks after the Eurovision, and I wandered in, and there was a fellow called Peter, an old man called Peter, who used to work with me because I worked with the ESB for 30 odd years in the power station there in Arigna. And Peter was there, and of course, when he sees me coming in, he said, "There's Charlie McGettigan now. The only time we ever see you now is on the television." And I said, "Oh, Peter, good to see you. As a matter of fact, we're on the Late Late Show this Friday." And he sort of paused, and he went, "I might watch it."
It's nice to get a compliment.
Oh yeah, you wouldn't know what way that to take it, But I loved I loved that, I loved
simplicity.
The thing about to live in, I came to live in Drumshambo in 1973, and I thought I was coming for six months. I thought, I was a little stopgap heading for here to go somewhere else, but the first night I was here, we were living in a place called Grattan Avenue in Drumshanbo, and the woman across the road knocked on the door. It was this time of the year, actually, November time, and it was wet and dark. And she said, "Will you come over for a cup of tea?" And I went over, and when I went over, she was Teresa Smullen. I realised she played the accordion. And the next thing, a fella called Packy Dignan, who was a concert flute player, he arrived in. And before we knew it, I had the guitar out and we were having a session. Good. And I said, "To hell with 6 months, I'm staying here. I like it." Yeah. And, Packy Dignan, for example, lived in a place called Gubberud at the top of a Rigna mountain. And Packy, he used to call his flute was known as his three-piece wallet. It was, the way a flute splits up the three, and he always had it inside of his inside pocket of his jacket. And the phrase came about. There was a fella called Pat Doherty, was what was known as a returned Yank. Do you remember those? Right. Yeah. He arrived back, bought a pub down at the foot of the town, and he used to stand at the door of the pub with a white suit and a big Stetson hat on, and he was known as the Jerk. Because he called everybody else a jerk, Right. Yeah, so he'll get out of my pub, you jerk, that kind of stuff. Yeah. But Packy used to kind of scoot in behind him, and he wouldn't be sitting down 5 minutes. Then somebody would be buying a drink for him, and he'd be playing in the corner. And Pat sort of said to me, "Listen here, Dagnan, get out of here with that goddamn three-piece wallet of yours and don't come back." So I thought, three-piece wallet, there's a great idea for a song, That's how songs came about, and I'm ever indebted to the fact that I worked in the power station in Origna, because I would dealt with the administration, and everything came through me. Their wages, their medical problems, if they had medical problems, and they had to get. So I knew everything about everybody, and I'd often be going into to do a gig with my guitar under my arm, and some fella said, "I only got one overtime shift this week. I should have got two."
You're mixing the work with the music, yeah.
Oh yeah, and it kept you in touch with the real world, and I'm sure you know exactly what I mean when you were doing those little smugglings into the
ballroom,
yeah. That you could see, the way the world worked.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, all human life is in Drumshanbo.
Yeah. My guest today is Charlie McGettigan, winner of the Eurovision Song Contest in 1994. His book is called Rock and Roll Kids. It's a memoir, and we'll chat more about that too. But for myself, growing up in the ballroom was a great experience. I love the way the bands put so much effort into tuning up, testing, check, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. They spent time. There was a lot of time put into it. The bands themselves.
Yeah, people don't realize that. I tell you how it came to me. We were putting on. I was involved in the local drama society, and we decided we'd going to put on Oliver. The musical Oliver, written by Lionel Bart, based on Oliver Twist. And we had a meeting. We had a meeting before the thing. Would we have amplification or would we not have? And of course, I was considered the expert, and they asked me, "Well, what would that involve?" And I said, "Well, you'd have to have it down for a couple of nights rehearsal, and then for the nights and it turned out it would cost maybe about £500 at the time. £500. So there are only little things they stick on their sleeve. They didn't. Yeah. They didn't realize it was a mixing desk and speakers all over the place and lights and the whole kit and caboodle. So that's when you're talking about show bands. I mean,
the work behind the scenes.
Oh,
I recently went to see Jackson Browne here in concert in the Beacon in New York, and he's more than yourself. He's a very talented writer, songwriter, musician. But he has one song dedicated to the
sound crew,
the sound crew, the roadies, the people that set up all the equipment, get it ready for the big show, and then at the end of the night, when all the audience have left, these guys have to take it all down again and pack it into trucks and off to the next gig.
Yeah,
so there's a lot of behind the scenes work that goes into it.
Huge amount, and Paul McCartney as well. He always at the end of the tour he does a special tribute to the sound crew. I actually have a song called "The Silent Heroes," which is a song about the things we take for granted, the very house you live in, the very fact that you have a light, the furniture that you sit on. Right. These are people. I do my job, and I get a huge round of applause every night at the end of the night, and everybody's very excited. But nobody ever praises these people. The fella that that made the computer, the fella that the basic things that we take for granted that are there, and we complain when they're not there. That's
That's
the only
true.
time. But we never sort of stand up and give them a round of applause.
Yeah, when I had my venue in Roscommon as well, I owned a bar called the Sheep Walk In a number of years back. You played it a number of times there.
Indeed, yeah.
And Kathy Durkin, a good friend of mine too, she played there several times too. And Kathy would always sing that song, "A Working Man I
Working
Am."
man, yeah,
Yeah.
great.
And
Yeah,
it became a very catchy tune, and Kathy's a great woman indeed.
yeah, yeah.
Great admiration for her.
I worked with Kathy for a while as well, for
Yeah, great,
about
great
2
person.
years, yeah.
Great
Yeah,
person.
yeah,
So tell
yeah.
me more about the book.
Well, the book again,
when
you know,
did you get it published? How long is it out?
it's about a month out now.
Oh,
I wrote it over a period of 2 years. When the lockdown came,
yeah,
there was nothing much, there was no
right,
music happening, and sort of I
right,
was sitting here twiddling my thumbs, and I'm
right.
not a kind of a fella that can sit around and just do
No,
nothing. So I started into it, and
right.
you know, it's wrong. I think I can't repeat this enough. I think every single person has a book in them.
Oh, I agree.
If they only stop and think, you know. And I do a radio program every Saturday morning, and I do another one on a Wednesday on one of the local stations here, Shannonside Northern Sound. It covers about 6 or 7 counties,
Hmm.
and I normally have guests on the program,
Great.
and they come on and they talk to me just like we're talking now.
Right,
But mostly there'd be musicians and people who
right.
are putting on dramas or writing books or poets or whatever it is. But I maintain that I could walk out onto the street and the first person I met and sit them down in front of me and say, ask the right question, and
Sorry.
off they'll go. They have
Mm.
a story, you know, and they wouldn't even know themselves. I mean, I have people coming in and they say, what are we going to talk about for an hour? You
Yeah,
know, and by the time the hour is up, they say, "Oh, but I didn't get to and I didn't get to mention that. And I
yeah.
didn't get to, you know."
Yeah.
I think the story, if you
Like
and
this book is Stoney's like first
yes,
book, okay? And he's a good storyteller. He has lots of stories, but to get him to sit down and write and tell them. So I explained to him one day. I met Maeve Binchy years ago on the Late Late Show, and Maeve was a great woman too. She used to write a lot of girly books. I call them like for teenage girls type of thing, romance books. And outside after the show, oh, there was about 20 or 30 young Dublin teenage girls, and they're looking for the autographs. And they're screaming at Maeve, how do you write a book? And Maeve said, I'm going to tell you how to write a book.
yeah,
And then there was silence. And this exact words I said to my friend Stoney. I said, if you write one page every day, at the end of a year, you'll have a book.
yeah,
Of course, he started writing,
yeah,
and he felt he had to go to 365 pages.
yes.
And I said, wherever it ends, you know.
Yeah, but funny,
But
Michael
that's how you
Harding.
write a book.
We're lucky to have Michael Harding living in the area. Have you heard of Michael Harding?
Yes, I have.
He wrote he's got a load of books out now. He's Staring at Lakes was his first book.
Mhm.
But Michael Harding had something in common with Maeve Binchy, in that Maeve Binchy used to write a column every Saturday for the Irish Times,
Mhm.
and it was based. She might have it on. I was sitting in the hairdressers this
Yeah.
week, you know, and I was listening to them talking about where they were on their holidays and what they were doing and what was their lives. And she wrote a column every week about just the little conversations
Simple,
that
yeah.
she had with people.
Mm.
And I think that's another good guideline, is to
It
listen
is.
to what people are saying and you know, keep a journal or a diary or whatever way you
Yeah.
want to do it.
Yeah, keep a journal, a diary.
And Michael Harding did the same. He wrote he still writes every Wednesday in the Irish Times, and I love his work, you know. And I love the idea of saying to him, Michael, I knew you when you were nothing, because
Yeah,
Michael was originally a priest at one point,
right.
and his stories in the first book, Staring at Lakes, are you know, about his priesthood
Right.
in Derry Lynn and the kind of characters he met and the people that he met, and you know, he even was attacked by the provost at one point
Right.
for something that he said in a sermon,
You're
you
right.
know. But mostly it's finding the fun
Yeah.
in fun
Another guest I have on a podcast as well, talented like yourself, Oliver O'Connell. He's
yeah,
from Burn in County Clare, and he's produced a DVD. It's called A Journey, Not the Destination, and that's about life in general. And has combined poetry and music and the scenery of the Burn. It's a beautiful. So I'll tell my listeners to watch out for that podcast with Oliver O'Connell. A Journey,
yeah.
Not a Destination. My guest today is Charlie McGettigan, Eurovision Song Contest winner from 1994. His book is called Rock and Roll Kids. Is that the title, Charlie?
That's it. No, it's called Forever a Rock and Roll Kid.
Now, I'm glad you corrected me. Forever a Rock and Roll Kid.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
Forever a Rock and Roll Kid, my listeners can check that out. And a little more, where can we get, you're going to give me your website, I guess.
Yeah, well, if you're from Ireland, you can get it in most good bookshops around the
Okay.
place. But if you want to get it online,
Yeah.
you can go to www.battlebridgepress. That's BATTLEBRIDGEPRESS, all one word.
Okay, all one word.
.com. So
Okay.
it's www.battlebridgepress.com.
Right.
It's where you can buy it.
And it would be remiss of me not to mention my surname, Shea Healy wrote to Eurovision called What's Another Year?
Yeah,
And
I knew Shea very well.
He was, I knew him well too. He was a gentleman,
lovely man. Yeah,
lovely man. He only died last year,
very sad.
2021. It was sad, yeah.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
was
Funny story about Shea. Shea had Parkinson's,
right.
and it was very difficult for him, but he always made fun of it.
Right.
And I remember we were playing at a concert one night, and Shea arrived, and he said, "I said, do you want to go to dinner before the concert?" And we sat down and we were having dinner. And then during the course of dinner, do you want to get up and sing a song? You know, and he had a quite difficult shake, you know, in his hand and his body, and it was quite painful. But he said, yeah, I'll get up and sing. So during the thing, I said, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome somebody who's here tonight, a great songwriter and great man, Shea Healy. And he gets up on the stage and he's kind of shaking around like this. And he says into the microphone, he says, here I am. He says, the sniper's nightmare.
Yeah. I love that humor.
Yeah, because he had a fun thing to say. No matter how bad things were, he remained positive. And we lost an awful lot. We lost an awful lot when we lost Shea. You know.
Yeah, he was surely a talent.
Yeah.
The song he won with was "What's Another Year."
Yeah, seemingly about his father. I didn't realize that.
His father losing his wife at the time. Yeah. I spoke to Oliver O'Connell about that as well, because Oliver lost his wife too.
Yeah.
But like Shea, Oliver has a very positive outlook. It's a very important podcast for my listeners to watch because he beat cancer twice.
Good man.
And I speak about that because I had a brain cancer surgeon, science guy on here as well from Sloan Catering, and we talked a lot about the research into cancer and all that. And just like Oliver beat the cancer twice, the day before I interviewed the scientist guy, I had met an older man who had beaten cancer too. And I said to the older man, about 84 years old, I said, what do you put it down to? So he said, science, doctors, and God. So when I interviewed the scientist from Sloan Catering, Sergey was his name, I said, where does God come into this? And I was hoping he'd have the right answer for me, and he did. He said, you must have hope, he said. If the person that gets cancer and they have no hope, they're thrown in the towel. But the person who has hope has a better chance of beating the cancer than the person that hasn't. And that's another good podcast to listen to. Sergey Yanulich from Sloan Catering.
You get very interesting people, a wide variety of people.
I get
humbled to be on there.
I do get a wide variety of people. I have real estate people, I have brokers, I have lawyers and nurses and everybody. I even have a clown from Cork that studied at Clown University in Paris, professional clown, Ed Malone. And I have musicians here in York. John Malone is on it. Ernie Savage is here in Manhattan. He writes jingles, like, before the news, that short little thing.
Yeah.
Very successful. And he has he'd be kind of similar to yourself. He has a lot of ditties in that just come out of nowhere.
John, I must interrupt you. We lost somebody very important in Irish music just about 6 months ago. Yeah. Mick Maloney, the great Mick Maloney.
Wow. Yeah.
Mick passed away, and Mick was somebody I admired. I heard Mick first with the Johnstons. Do you remember the Johnstons?
Right. Yeah.
Free band, more of the traveling people and all like that. And I went to see them in concert, and ever since I was just knocked out by his music. Because in those days with the Johnsons, the great Paul Brady and Mick Maloney were the two men, and Adrian and Lucy. And there's another book I'll recommend, is Paul Brady's book. He has a great biography or autobiography now out at the moment. Really good, very interesting, because when the Johnsons went to America, they had a really strange time. Brady at one point was busking to get enough money to post a letter home. Things got that bad. But he was eventually really successful, and was playing with Bob Dylan and all kinds of great people. So that's another book. Crazy Dreams is the name of the book by Paul Brady.
Right. Well, your book is Forever Rock and Roll Kids. Charlie McGettigan is my guest. The podcast is called It's Good to Talk. If you like the podcast, hit like, subscribe, and tune into the many, many, many more podcasts. What else can we add to the discussion, Charlie?
Well, I suppose what's happening now, I suppose, at this point, and I'm 72 next month, and I never thought in my wildest dreams, because I still feel about 22,
But you're a forever rock and roll kid.
Yeah, we're still, exactly, and it's not a bad label to have, you get such consolation. Paul and myself, as I said earlier, we're playing last Saturday night down in Monaghan, lovely theatre. There's a huge theatre scene now in Ireland, because when Michael D was Minister for Arts and Culture, he built a lot of art centres and cultural centres, and you can actually make a living just playing in these places. They're everywhere, and they're all state of the art. He invested a lot of money in the thing, and they're well worth having. So there's a very vibrant theatre scene here. And funny, I must talk to you about The Banshees of Inisheer, this new film with Conor Farrell and Brendan Gleeson in it. I went to see it the other night, and it's a tour de force. And I think they're going to be up for Oscars for this. We're going to have, this is just it's a dark. It's about living on a small island. Inisheer is a small island that's mentioned, and two men that have always hung out together, and we're always together in the pub, and we're always friends. One of them decides he doesn't like the other fella anymore, and there's no explanation. And of course, when they're living on a side, he says, "I don't want you to ever talk to me again." And the poor other fella is played by Colin Farrell. Brendan Gleeson's the fella that doesn't want to. And the fact that they're living in such a small community, they're constantly crossing paths. And the poor fella that's been left, he can't understand what did he do. But it's a brilliant film, and there isn't a bad act. Every single aspect of the movie is brilliant. So
don't give away the whole story.
Oh no, The Banshees of Inisheer is the name of it, and I think you watch out for the Oscars.
I will indeed. Your book is called Forever Rock and Roll Kids. My guest is Charlie McGettigan. He says he's 72, but as Betty White always says, the older you get, the better you get, unless you're a banana.
I haven't heard that one before.
Well, she lived to be 99, I think.
One of the people I left out of the book, and was a fella called Fingers Gallagher. He was a fella that he was a cattle dealer, but he was always hanging around the streets of Ballyshannon when we were growing up. And somebody said at one stage that this woman came up to him because he'd always something smart to say about something, and she said, "I'm a bit worried about John. I think he might be gay." Sure, missus, that's nothing. My daughter's gone out with a guard.
That's good.
There you go.
That's the innocence.
Yes.
The innocence of country folk and country life,
Yeah.
And you never know if they're for real or not.
Yeah, just in case people don't know.
The other story in your book that I was reading near the front was about the two young men in the schoolroom where we all spoke Gaelic going to school, and if you wanted permission to go to the bathroom, you got to say Anwyl Cadagum Dulamak in Irish, and the teacher would say you can. And in that case, your two buddies, none was teaching them. Is that right?
Yeah, Sister Rosario. Sister Rosario, we had Sister Rosario for First Communion, and it was my first crush. I think she was a lovely. She used to be constantly blushing, and it's such a lovely, lovely nun. But Peter used to, when you got to first class, you had 2 years behind you, and you kind of got to know the run of the place, And Peter one day said, "Well, can I go and I did, can I go out to the toilet?" "Oh yes, Peter, go on ahead." And she was delighted that he spoke in Irish, And so. And he went out. Then the next day, "Well, Cadagum Dulamak," and he went out. And just as he finished, Arthur, he put up his hand, "Well, Cadagum Dulamak freshen. Can I go out too?" So this was going on for a few days, and eventually she decided to follow the two of them out, see what they were doing. And they were peeing up against the back wall of the school to see who could get the highest on the wall. And she said, got the two of them by the scruff of the neck and brought them up to the Reverend Mother. And she said, "Reverend Mother, you won't believe what these boys were doing." "What were they doing?" "They were urinating up against the back wall of the school to see how high they could get up on the wall. And what did you do, sister? Well, I hit the roof, she said. Well, that wasn't bad for an aunt.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
A great
I
story.
wondered did they make that up or did it happen?
I'm sure it happened. I'm sure it happened, yeah. Boys will be boys.
Yeah,
the name of the book is Forever Rock and Roll Kids by Charlie McGettigan, my guest today. The podcast is called It's Good to Talk. If you like it, hit subscribe, hit like. And we can get your book on the website.
www.battlebridgepress.com.
Right.
You should write that up on your wall there behind, and they'll see that every day.
It'll be on the bottom of this screen here. Don't worry.
Oh, well.
There you go. Yeah. So it's Good to Talk. Name of the podcast. I think we have covered a lot of ground there. This podcast will go out. Your book will be perfect Christmas gift. Encourage people to promote it and buy it.
It's made of the best. It's made of the best quality paper. Very absorbent. If you spill something, you can. So it's great practical use as well as intellectual use.
I like that. And of course, I also interviewed Brian Layden from Sligo there, and I bought his 3 books: Summer of '63, The Home Place, and Sweet Tales of New York. Yeah. Brian has been on my podcast too. He did a story about the Shemore ambush, and we also spoke about the Battle of Glenamoy, where I grew up myself, and Captain Healy was one of the guys that lost his life there. No relation of mine. We're just related through alcohol and wisdom.
Just in case that film I was talking about, it's The Banshees of Inisheer, and it's set in 1923, and they're on this island, and you can hear the shooting and the bombs going off on the mainland where the civil war is raging, and it's just they've a lovely remoteness and yet interest in the civil war, the people on the island. Yeah, so it's well worth it. Well worth it. I can't recommend it highly.
I interviewed another guy there, Gerald O'Hara. He's from Foxford, and he has a book out also, and that's on my podcast too. So check Gerald out as well, Gerald O'Hara, on my podcast as well. So a lot of stuff between the music and the Civil War. We have a lot of noise going on. I had Seamus Caulfield on from the Cage of Fields, and it would be remiss of me not to mention that from the time you won the Eurovision, out of that came Riverdance, because the music was commissioned for Mary Robinson, who was the president of Ireland at the time.
Yeah.
And then the year later, it went on to be the
huge success it was. Absolutely.
A huge success. So it's like serendipity. If you guys hadn't won the Eurovision, Riverdance wouldn't have flown from there.
Well, it was privilege. I always pinch myself and think I was there the first night that Riverdance went. Flatley and Jean Butler shot across the stage, and it made Irish dancing sexy. If that makes sense, And I remember we were in the green room. It was the interval act, and everybody in the green room was preoccupied. I wonder how we did, and I wonder will we win.
Counting the votes, yeah.
But it came on in a big screen, the Riverdance, and everybody stopped.
Yeah.
And people's jaws just dropped.
Oh yeah.
They were in awe, totally in awe, and it was just a magnificent thing to see, And Paul used to talk about Michael Flatley had all these rumours that people were talking about. Somebody said he could do 120 steps in a minute, a minute. Yeah. And Paul was on with Pat Kenny, and they were talking about this, and he could do 120 taps in a minute. And Harrington immediately said, that's nothing. We have a plumber over in Killester, and you want to see the number of taps he can do in a minute.
I love it, Charlie. And we'll sign off because we had a good chat.
Great to talk.
The book is called Forever Rock and Roll Kids, and I'll put up your website where people can buy it. And my website is jhfornews@yahoo.com. Podcast is Good to Talk, and it sure is always good to talk to you, Charlie.